This is Jim Vankoski, president of the Sports Legends of Delaware County Museum. I'm here with Rich Pagano, our chief historian. And excitingly enough, Rich, we're into part two of our Emlen Tunnell card set. In 2017, Choice Marketing developed a card set. And it was a collaborative endeavor with you and Phil Damiami, myself, Harry Chaikin, a gentleman by the name of Larry Schmidt, who's a historian from the New York Giants. And we determined which photographs we should use and the text on the back of this Life and Times of Emlen Tunnell card set. Our session one, part one, we did the first eight cards.
Right.
And we're going to do cards 9 through 16 today. But we're not rushing through here. If we have something to say about each and every one of these cards, we'll step up and say it.
And we have a lot to say about that.
We have a lot to say. I know you do. Every now and then I'll chime in. So card number 9 is New York Giants playing career card. And I want to say something about that image. That image is something that was really unusual because when we first moved into the museum, in 2016 in Radnor at 301 Ivan Avenue, there was a gentleman there by the name of Jim Corcoran. Jim Corcoran worked for the Public Service Department. He came up to me, introduced himself, and said, Mr. Vankoski, I said, just call me Jim. He said, I would like to do a portrait of a couple of your athletes that you have in your museum. Would you mind doing that? Well, I said, you're an artist? He said, well, I'm not going to call myself an artist. He said, then he showed me his cell phone, some of the works that he did. My jaw dropped to the floor.
He is an artist.
So when you look at that image that we just had on the screen, that's the work of Jim Corcoran. And that's Emlen Tunnell. One of the things I really like about this, and you can help us out, is there's no face mask there.
Right.
I think I was told that he was like one of the last players to actually go without a face mask.
I've heard that too about him, yeah.
So that's a very interesting photograph. And Emlen Tunnell played for the New York Giants from 1948 to 1958, and he was the first African American to play for the New York Giants. In 1948, we have an image of a vintage uniform on the screen at this point in time that shows you how plain those uniforms were back there in 1958. And I kind of like them.
No names on the back.
No names on the back. And he wore number 45. Now, we remembered in our previous segment that in high school he wore number 44.
Right.
And then when he played for the University of Iowa, he wore number 12.
Yes.
And now when he's starts with the New York Giants, he's wearing number 45. So and people like he stuck with that number throughout his entire career.
Yeah, what's interesting too, on the back of that card, they talk about how, he was this unscouted free agent. So he wasn't drafted, but there was a draft at that time in the NFL. But I really think they did know a little bit about him. I don't think he was totally unscouted. But he hitchhiked up, he got out on Lancaster Avenue and hitchhiked to New York and walked right into Tim Mara's office, who was the owner and president of the New York Giants, and basically asked him for a tryout, and they gave him a tryout.
Keeping in mind that he was the first African American to play for the New York Giants. So
exactly.
That was...
And I think that card does also mention some of the racism that he came in contact with in New York. You're pretty familiar. Remember the story, the first time he went to a bank in New York, and he wanted to cash a check, and they're looking at him like, there's no African Americans that play for the New York Giants. Who are you? So he had some problems, and I know staying some of the places that some of the other teams that they played, he had to stay in a separate hotel and things like that.
Well, even in New York, he had to stay at a separate hotel.
Yeah. So he definitely ran into racism at that time.
Well, because we have to remember that Jackie Robinson. It was just 1947 when he broke the color barrier for baseball.
Exactly.
So we're talking 1948, 1 year later. So it was a time in the history of the United States that we don't really like to remember, but it's something it's part of our history.
Right.
And there's some unusual things that come up. He talked about, I remember reading an article, and the person who wrote the text in the back of this was Larry Schmidt. And we must thank him because he's a historian for the New York Giants. And one of the articles I read, doing some research, was Emlen Tunnell said, you know, I really didn't like it when we couldn't stay in the same hotel, or instead of staying in different hotels, we had to stay in the same hotel. He said, because where I stayed before that took place, he said there was no curfew. He said, I didn't have anybody telling me what time I had to be.
Time you had to come in.
Yeah. He said, but as soon as you had to stay in the same hotel, now you had to fight with a curfew. So that's kind of an interesting situation.
Well, yeah, some of the things he wrote on the back there too, and I thought in 1952, Emlen had a total of 924 yards, and that's for kick, punt, and interception yardage. And actually at that year, it was more than the leading rusher in the NFL, which is really an interesting statistic. And then in 1956, 4 years later, he took them and they won the the NFL championship.
And as a matter of fact, they gave him a nickname.
Yes.
I think as a result of that season, perhaps. Do you recall that nickname in terms of Mr. Offense on defense?
Yes.
It's amazing that a defensive player would actually lead the league.
Yes.
In yards gained.
That had never been done before. He changed the game defensively.
And he played in a total of 167 games.
Yeah.
And 143 were consecutive.
Yes.
So he was, which Rich brings to mind, when we talked about in part one, we said that in high school he was injured.
Yes.
And then when he went to college, he broke his neck. But yet he played 13 seasons in the NFL without being injured.
He missed one game in his entire career in the NFL. So I don't know if he had an injury or who knows, but if you can play that many years, 14 years, and only miss one game, you're pretty durable. It's an amazing statistic.
So then in 1958, he left the New York Giants. How'd that happen? Do you notice, what happened there when he left the New York Giants?
Yeah, there's some controversy there that Tom Landry was the defensive coach, and Vince Lombardi was the offensive coach of the New York Giants. And there was talk that Landry wasn't going to start him. So Vince Lombardi had left and took over the Green Bay Packers as general manager and coach. And the first thing he did when he got to Green Bay, he brought Emlen Tunnell with him. He called up and Emlen left the Giants and went to Green Bay after 11 years. And of course, played at Green Bay for 3 years for Vince Lombardi, and was I think he was with Green Bay. He helped really get and recruit some of the African American players to come to Green Bay. I don't think it was they didn't have such a good team and such a good record, and of course Vince Lombardi changed that. But he was very valuable to Vince Lombardi, and I think that's why he brought him.
That's probably the motivation that Vince Lombardi wanted to bring Emlen Tunnell to Green Bay so he could help recruit some of the African American players.
No doubt.
To come to Green Bay, because Green Bay in 1959, was it?
Yeah, 59.
In 1959, it wasn't populated with very many African Americans.
No, it wasn't.
And there's some stories that we might get to a little bit later in the book that refers to that. So that image that we had on the screen was an image with Vince Lombardi and Emlen Tunnell. And it's really an exciting time because he became involved in coaching as well.
Well, actually, when he retired in 1961, he became a scout for the Giants and the Green Bay Packers. He was scouting for both. And then after a year or so, he just went and scouted for the New York Giants, became the first. He was the first African American to play for the Giants, the first African-American scout in the NFL, and as we'll see a little later, some other firsts. He's a man of many firsts.
Well, we just got through talking about Emlen Tunnell's career with the Giants and the Packers, and we have two jerseys up here. And one jersey is a New York Giants that from 1948. It's a replica jersey, compliments of Mitchell and Ness at the time.
Yeah.
And then we have the Green Bay Packers jersey, which we just got last week from their community outreach organization, which was awfully nice of them to provide us with a Green Bay Packer jersey. Now, the Green Bay Packer jersey that you see there is one that's modern. It's an up-to-date jersey. The 1948 Giants is more of a vintage jersey.
Right.
But it's nice having those, and we'll be keeping them in our museum for the time being. So it's fun to come back and look at those items. Now, the next card that we have, Compliments of Choice Marketing, is entitled Footsteps of a Giant.
Yes.
And it has to do with that book that you have.
Yes. This is Emlen Tunnell's autobiography that was done in 1966, about 5 years after he retired from the NFL. And it's just loaded with stories about his whole career, growing up in the Garrett Hill section of Radnor Township and playing high school sports and college football and basketball. And he just has some great stories too once he got to New York, because he became very good friends with Charlie Connerly, who was the longtime quarterback of the New York Giants. And I always, he had a great quote that I really always like. I wasn't afraid of prejudice, but I didn't intend to go looking for it. And that's just one of many outstanding quotes in the book. That,
I think we could probably say that he was more concerned with performance than he was for looking for problems.
Yeah.
Because he did have an outstanding career. And that book, it's kind of interesting because we just produced a book, Tales from the Museum, a collaborative anthology, much like the card set. And the reason I'm bringing that out is when I was doing some research that tried to, because you wrote two books. You know, this is the first book that I was involved with.
Right.
And they talked about how it's nice to have a villain. A villain is something that energizes a book. Matter of fact, they mentioned Nurse Ratched. Remember Nurse Ratched in that movie? She was a villain, and she sort of like energized the book.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
But when you start talking about Emlen Tunnell, can you think of any villains in that book?
No.
No.
Well, he has a famous quote that has to be mentioned, that he always looked at the good in people and not the bad. And he said most of the time he found goodness in most people. And I think that sums up the way he viewed life. Yeah.
So the two statues that we presently have in Delaware County, one in honor of Mickey Vernon.
Right.
Rich Westcott wrote a book on him. And then we have Emlen Tunnell. And both those gentlemen, you'd be hard pressed to find an enemy. I mean, they were so common in terms of their personality. And when you read Mickey Vernon's book, you can't find too many villains in that book either.
No.
So that's something that, if you're looking for villains, you're not going to be able to find them in that book.
And I think Bob Feller's quote, you could say for Emlen too, if you didn't like Emlen Tunnell or Mickey Vernon, you didn't like anyone. And I think that fits both of them, really.
Now, that book is no longer published, this book.
No, that book is out of print. Once in a while you can find it at a used bookstore or on the internet or at Amazon.
And we're going to give somebody some tip. Emlen Tunnell is going to become more popular as time goes on.
Yes,
and
no
we'll
doubt.
find out a little bit later on in the show. Yeah. So if you're interested in getting an Emlen Tunnell book, you might want to do it now because the price of that book is going to go up. Now, do you know? I wonder. I'm not sure if they have that in the Radnor Library or not. If there's an Emlen Tunnell book,
I don't know.
We probably have to do some research on that just to find out, is there an Emlen Tunnell book? Because would you say it's worth reading?
Without a doubt, yes. Outstanding. But then again, Emlen is still. There's still many people have no idea who he is.
And we're trying to
hoping
change that.
Yeah,
we're hoping to change that because he is the most, what should I say, one of the most revered athletes in the history of Delaware County.
without a doubt.
Certainly one of the most successful.
And a World War II hero.
And a World War II hero, which we'll be spending some time on that as well a little bit later on. Now, the next card that we have deals with Emlen being inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
1967, first African American, first defensive player. And I think, and I can't remember who wrote on the back of that card, but he talks about who he thanked when he received his award out there in Canton. You know, Tim Marin, and but he talks about the West Indian immigrant that picked him up in the banana truck that took him into New York City when he traveled to see Tim Marin in 1948. And it's just such a funny story, you know. He just talks about how he went out on Lancaster Avenue and just started hitchhiking. And at some point, this fellow in the banana truck picked him up. And I guess that was his last ride.
We have a photo of Emlen Tunnell accepting his bust, getting into the Hall of Fame. And in the back, they have all the past Hall of Famers that came back, which is, you know, a ritual that they do.
Right.
And when you look at the past Hall of Famers, all you see is white players, ex-players.
Yes.
And somewhat, well, naturally, because Emlen's the first African American to be inducted into the Football Hall of Fame.
Exactly.
That picture really speaks volumes. I really think it speaks volumes.
And that's where they mentioned, too, that he only missed one game in his entire career and 167 games, you know.
I took some notes, and you know these just as well as anybody. When he retired, he had the most career interceptions.
Right.
When he retired, he had the most punt returns. When he retired, most yardage by interception and most yardage by punt return. And on Gil Brandt, I think he's listed the top 50, 25 safeties, defensive backs of all time. And I was listening to that. And he started out, he gets down to number 10, and still no Emlen Tunnell. And I'm thinking, geez, Emlen Tunnell, once he gets down to number 5, still no Emlen Tunnell. I'm thinking, he's not going to mention Emlen Tunnell. Gets down to number 2, there's still Emlen Tunnell. And no way, I'm thinking that Emlen Tunnell can't be the top defensive back of all time. But number 1, according to Gil Brandt, Emlen Tunnell is the top defensive back of all time. And still very few people can pronounce his name.
No.
But it's something that the best defensive back of all time. That's saying something. And that was 1967 when he was inducted into the Football Hall of Fame.
And we're still looking for a video of him speaking at that ceremony.
There is one on YouTube.
There is, with him accepting the award.
Yes.
Okay. I have to check that out.
And one of the Bill Parcells, one of the great stories about him talking about Emlen Tunnell was in one of the plaques that's in the locker room.
Yeah.
Talks about Emlen's philosophy of the way to build a football team. So it's really inspirational, really, when you see that. So if you get a chance to Google Bill Parcells' talk, his acceptance speech to getting into the Hall of Fame. It's worth listening to. At the very, very end, he talks about Emlen Tunnell. So that was Gil Brandt, you know, saying he's the top of all time. Pro Football Hall of Fame. All right, next we mentioned this before, there's an image on the screen that he became the first full-time assistant coach. And the years I have on that are 63 to 73, thereabouts.
Yes. Because he stopped coaching in 73 and went back to being a full-time scout in 73, and then that was only for a couple years.
And we have a great story in this book about Don Clune.
Yes.
Who went to Cardinal O'Hara, University of Pennsylvania, and he was scouted by Emlen Tunnell.
Right. And Emlen Tunnell came to his house to pick him up. They were going to camp up New York Giants up in upstate. And they got on the train in 30th Street, and he said, Don Clune was also a guitar player. He's a musician. And he said Emlen Tunnell was carrying my guitar case. And he was singing. And he said he was great. He came and knocked on the door. He said, I'm Emlen Tunnell from the New York Giants, and I'm here to bring you to camp. And
there's a great story written by Erica Berman, one of our board members, in the book regarding that. It's a classic. It's a classic Delaware County story.
Exactly.
And Don Clune is a guitar player. He's very good.
Very good one.
Matter of fact, we have to contact him, have him compose a couple songs for us. The sports legends of Delaware County. You know how they have Willie, Mickey, and the Duke?
Yeah.
That baseball song. Maybe we could get something.
That's a good idea.
It is a good idea. It's right on the spot. You're seeing it here first. So Don Clune, if any of your friends are watching this, we need you to write a Willie, Mickey, and the Duke. Only Emlen, Mickey.
And I think, and Don was there when Emlen passed away in 1975 too. That was in July. That was at camp. And did Don tell us that he went to the viewing?
We in the book we have the mask, the prayer card.
Yeah,
or the mask card, whatever we want to refer to it.
Yeah,
which is, Don, you still have that? Don's one of those unusual individuals, and you know some of them perhaps, that saves prayer cards. Every time they go to a viewing, they save the card. So he saved them.
And he had that.
And we actually have that on display in our museum. Very unusual thing that Don would do that. So we're spending a lot of time on Don Clune.
Yeah,
and rightfully so. Rightfully so, because he was an outstanding story for Delaware County sports.
And I think on the back of that card too, the quote by John Mara, who's the owner and president of the Giants now. It's fair to say that Emlen was the most beloved member of our organization, perhaps in its history. That's quite of course, I would love them to retire his jersey. They haven't done that, but
it's coming. At some point in time, it's coming.
Yeah.
But the other fact that I like to talk about in terms of when he passed, this was Larry Schmidt also wrote the card on being the first full-time assistant coach. And I know Phil Damiami regrets that he died so young. He was only 50 years old when he died, because he said guaranteed he would be the first African-American head football coach in the history of the NFL, had he survived.
Probably, yeah.
So that's Emlen Tunnell as the scout. All right, our next card is called A Chance Meeting. And we have a picture on the screen of Emlen when he was in the Coast Guard. We're backtracking a little bit. When he was in the Coast Guard playing on a basketball team for the Coast Guard. And this picture was given to a gentleman by the name of William McKinstry. And at the time, he was working in the Delaware Bay sector of the Coast Guard. And he was a lieutenant at that point in time. He's now a commander. And a visitor came. And I'm probably going to mispronounce the visitor. Dan Ferolia.
Yeah.
Okay, but he brought a photo album with him. And the photo album had that picture. And on the back, people do this. When you take a picture, put the names of the people on the back of that picture.
Help us researchers.
Help the researchers do that. Well, anyway, they had the names of the pictures of the people that were in the picture, and Bill McKinstry recognized one of the names. And he recognized one of the names because he was a football fan. And one of those names was Emlen Tunnell.
Oh, right.
So Bill McKinstry says, he was shocked to find that Emlen Tunnell was in that.
In that Coast Guard basketball picture.
On that basketball picture. And one of the reasons why he knew Emlen Tunnell as a football player, and help me out again, we're talking about the person who broke his record.
Paul Krause.
Paul Krause.
Yeah.
Bill McKinstry remembered reading in the newspaper way back when Paul Krause broke Emlen Tunnell's record.
For career interceptions.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's kind of an interesting situation. Now, Bill McKinstry, that started him doing some research on Emlen Tunnell. And when he did the research, he found out that not only was he a great football player, but he was a World War II hero. And we talked about that in a previous segment. Now, the next photograph that we're looking at is Coast Guard Island, Alameda, California. Another interesting story. I have a niece, Dana Vankoski, married my nephew, Matt, who is still in the Coast Guard, and at this time, she was working at the U.S. Coast Guard Island in Alameda, California, and she knew about the Emlen Tunnell Gymnasium that they named in honor of him. And Matt, my nephew, he said, yeah, I play basketball there just about 2-3 times a week. Matt played at Notre Dame, so he's a good. I said, you're kidding. So I got a hold of Dana. I said, Dana, could you tell me how that happened? How did this gym get named after Emlen Tunnell? And she got me Bill McKinstry's contact information, and we contacted Bill McKinstry, and he said that the amount of work that he did, and this was 2011 is when this gym was named.
It was named after
him. And in order to have a building named after you, they said, is a very special honor. The core value, you had to represent core values. And the core values were honor, respect, and devotion to duty.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about when we talk about Emlen Tunnell.
But this story is so amazing because it goes back to seeing that picture of him in the Coast Guard basketball team.
Yes.
And doing some research about him. And
so Bill McKinstry, he's the unsung hero.
Yeah, right.
When it comes to the I don't think would the Sports Legends of Delaware County have erected a statue in honor of Emlen Tunnell if it wasn't for his military heroic deeds?
Well, I think, the combination of both, being an outstanding person, but a great athlete, and the World War II, saving two of his, shipmates, and it's just I'm not so sure, but I thanks to Phil Damiani, who pushed it, that we need to do a statue on this guy. And I agreed. He's fantastic.
We're certainly not sorry that we did it, because every day, with each and every day, we find out more and more about Emlen Tunnell. Even to the extent that we found out that perhaps, and we don't know this for sure, maybe somebody in the audience could help us out, his wife is still living.
Yes, I'm not so sure that's true, though.
No, I'm not either, but I was told by a good source that there is this possibility that Mrs. Tunnell is still living. So that's our research that we have to do.
Yeah.
She would be about 94 years old at this point in time. But there's plenty of people that are...
And lives in Arizona, in that same neighborhood where Ted Dean, who we really didn't mention, that in the 1960 championship game when the Eagles played Green Bay, that you had two Radnor high school graduates playing, Emlen Tunnell for the Green Bay Packers and Ted Dean for the Philadelphia Eagles.
So we actually finished part 2, and we have one more part to go. And you'll have to come back in a couple of months, and this will be the final segment on
Emlen gets something else named after him. And
yes, so that'll be a fun story for us. So we're signing out now. Rich Pagano and Jim Vankoski, Sports Legends of Delaware County. Take a look at our website, delcosportsmuseum.org, and we've also created a separate website for Emlen Tunnell, which is emlentunnell.org. So if you need to find out more information about Emlen Tunnell and the Sports Legends of Delaware County, just go to those sites or give me a call at 610-909-4919. And if you have any questions, Rich and I will be happy to try to answer them. Okay.